Hello everyone, I hope all of you are doing great. In this video lecture, we are going to study about the introduction and physiological anatomy of autonomic nervous system. We'll cover this topic for today's lecture under these headings. We'll look after the introduction, general organization of ANS, physiological anatomy of sympathetic division, and then the physiological anatomy of parasympathetic division. As we have already covered a little bit in the class, autonomic nervous system, it is a functional division of the nervous system. That means as there are many divisions like the motor system, the sensory system, autonomic nervous system is also a part of the functional division of nervous system. Autonomic nervous system controls the vegetative functions with the help of its innervation to the smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, as well as the secretory epithelium in the glands. So the autonomic nervous system innervates the smooth muscles in the eyes to control the pupil, or in the respiratory pathway, in cardiac muscles in the heart, and the secretory epithelium and the smooth muscles of the GI tract and various other glands. That is how it controls the secretion and vegetative functions of our body. Autonomic nervous system is further divided into two divisions, that is the sympathetic and the parasympathetic autonomic nervous system. Neurons are the basic functional and structural unit of the nervous system. As we know, all the divisions of the nervous system, let it be the sensory part or the motor part or the autonomic part, all of them perform their functions with the use of neurons. We will first learn how these neurons will be depicted in our diagrams. So the main parts of neurons are the cell body, its dendrites, which receives the signals or action potential from various other neurons, and then gives out a main branch, that is the axon, which then terminates into the other neurons. So this would be represented in a diagram with this circular dot as the cell body, this line as the axon, and these as the terminal buttons of a neuron. This representation is important to understand so that we can see in the diagram and understand the parts, or from where the neuron is arising and from where it is synapsing with the forward neurons. So coming to the general organization of autonomic nervous system, the outflow of this autonomic nervous system comes from various regions of the central nervous system. So there are autonomic areas in the cerebral hemisphere, which consist of limbic system, prefrontal cortex, hypothalamus, and parts of thalamus. That means these areas which are present in the cerebral hemisphere contributes to the control of autonomic nervous system. The limbic system, which is also a part of emotional response, has a major control over the autonomic nervous system, as well as the hypothalamus, which is also called as the head ganglion because it receives signals or receives sensory inputs from various parts of the body, and then give response in the form of endocrine, in the form of autonomic nervous system, to control the environment of the body. And the various other outputs comes from prefrontal cortex as well as from the parts of thalamus also, that were the output from the cerebral hemisphere. From this, the second output comes from autonomic centers in the brain stem. So there are gigantocellular nucleus and the parvocellular nucleus, which are also contributing to the control, which are the parts of reticular activating system. Apart from that, there are cranial nerves which are contributing to the parasympathetic nervous system. These cranial nerves are 3, 7, 9 and 10. So the nucleus of these cranial nerves, which are located in the brain stem, contributes to the control of the autonomic nervous system. Then comprises the autonomic centers in the spinal cord. So the main neurons are arising for the autonomic nervous system are arising from the spinal cord. Let us see. The parasympathetic and the sympathetic outflow are divided, and the sympathetic outflow is also called as thoracolumbar outflow. the sympathetic outflow is also called, or the sympathetic system is originating from the spinal cord. Which part of the spinal cord? It is originating from the thoracolumbar outflow, or the thoracolumbar segment of the spinal cord. So sympathetic system, thoracolumbar outflow, T1 to T12 and L1 and L2 segments. Whereas the parasympathetic system, they are called as a craniosacral outflow. So it is arising from the cranium, as we have already studied. The cranial nerves 3, 7, 9 and 10 are the cranial outflow of the parasympathetic system, and then the sacral S2, S3 and S4 are the sacral outflow of the parasympathetic system. What does this outflow means? This outflow means the neurons are arising from these segments of the spinal cord. Let us understand the basic structure of the peripheral part of the ANS. Peripheral part means the part of the autonomic nervous system which is arising from the spinal cord and then going till the organs. So how does the neurons, where the neurons are located, from where it is arising and how it is going, is the physiological anatomy of the peripheral part of autonomic nervous system. So the neurons in the autonomic nervous system are divided into two types of neurons, the preganglionic neurons and the postganglionic neurons. What are ganglions? Ganglions are the collection of cell body outside the nervous system, whereas the nucleus are the collection of cell body inside the central nervous system. So based on these ganglions, as you can see, there is a ganglion present here, or there is a ganglion present here. Okay, so based on that, the sympathetic peripheral part of the autonomic nervous system can be studied. So the neurons, which are divided into two types, as I told, preganglionic neurons and the postganglionic neurons. Let us understand the course of those preganglionic and the postganglionic neurons. So the neurons which are present, which are connecting the spinal cord, the thoracolumbar segment or the craniosacral segment. So the segments from the intermediolateral horn of the spinal cord to the ganglion will be called as the preganglionic neuron, whereas the neuron which connects the ganglion to the organ will be called as the postganglionic neuron. There is also the sensory part of the autonomic nervous system, that is, the sensation from the organs will be carried to the afferent neurons, which is a single neuron whose cell body lies on the dorsal root ganglion and then connects to the intermediolateral horn. So this comprises the afferent part of the, or the sensory part of the autonomic nervous system, arising from the organ and taking the impulses or the sensation through the dorsal root ganglion to the intermediolateral horn or the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. Let us study the physiological anatomy of sympathetic nervous system in details. Sympathetic nervous system can be studied under following headings: the sympathetic preganglionic neurons, sympathetic ganglia, sympathetic postganglionic neurons, and the sympathetic afferent fibers. Let us see first of all the sympathetic preganglionic neurons. As we have already studied what is preganglionic neurons, it is the neurons which are arising from the spinal cord and then going to the sympathetic ganglion. So these neurons, as we have seen in the figure, are arising from the thoracic segment and the lumbar segment, T1 to T12 of the thoracic segment, as well as L1 and L2 segment of the lumbar segment of the spinal cord. So this is how the preganglionic neurons are arising. As we can also see, these are arising from the segments of the spinal cord. Then there are the preganglionic neurons which innervates the adrenal medulla. The preganglionic neurons which innervates the adrenal medulla supplies the adrenal medulla and the cells of the adrenal medulla acts as the postganglionic neurons which secretes the neurotransmitter directly into the blood. Now coming to the second part, that is the sympathetic ganglia. So the sympathetic ganglia or the ganglia of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system can be divided into three types, that is the paravertebral ganglia, the prevertebral or collateral ganglia, and the peripheral or the terminal ganglia. So the neurons which are coming, or the preganglionic neurons which are coming from the spinal cord segments, can synapse in any of these three types of ganglia. It can either synapse in the paravertebral ganglia, it can either synapse in the prevertebral or collateral ganglia, or it can either synapse in the peripheral or the terminal ganglia. Let us see what are these ganglia. So the sympathetic trunk which you can see here, or the sympathetic chain which you can see here, is called as a paravertebral ganglia. Whereas these three ganglia which are present, the celiac ganglia, the superior mesenteric ganglia, and the inferior mesenteric ganglia, are also called as a prevertebral or the collateral ganglia. Whereas if there is any ganglia which is present near to the end organ, those will be called as the peripheral ganglia. So the prevertebral ganglia, the preganglionic fibers which are coming from the spinal cord, can synapse either in the sympathetic trunk or in the celiac ganglion or in the superior or inferior mesenteric ganglion, which are also called as the prevertebral ganglion and the peripheral ganglion. Now coming to the postganglionic sympathetic neurons, these are the neurons which arises from the ganglia, and these are the neurons which are arising from the ganglia and supplying to the smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, as well as the glands. As you can see, the smooth muscles in the eye, smooth muscles in the respiratory passage, smooth muscles in the GI tract, and the secretory cells like the lacrimal glands, the salivary glands, the secretory glands of the intestine, and also to the cardiac muscle. So the post-ganglionic neurons are arising from either from the paravertebral, prevertebral ganglion and supplying to the end organs. Let us see the course of these pre-ganglionic fibers, ganglion, and the post-ganglionic fibers in detail once again. So these fibers are arising, the sympathetic preganglionic neurons. The fibers, the cell body of the fibers, preganglionic neuron fibers, are located in the intermediolateral horn of the spinal cord. From there, they are traveling through the anterior horn of the spinal cord in the spinal nerve. They enter the white ramus here, since these neurons are the myelinated neurons. They form the white ramus. So the myelinated neurons, the preganglionic neurons, enters the white ramus and the sympathetic paravertebral chain or the paravertebral ganglia or the sympathetic trunk. So they enter the sympathetic trunk and they have three possibilities. They can either synapse with the ganglion which are present in the same level in the sympathetic trunk, or they can go up and down in the sympathetic trunk and then synapse in the ganglion present in the sympathetic trunk, or the third possibility is they don't synapse here in the sympathetic trunk, go directly and synapse to the prevertebral ganglion or the superior mesenteric, inferior mesenteric, or the celiac ganglion, which are present or which are the prevertebral ganglions. From there arises the post-ganglionic fibers or the post-ganglionic neurons, which then supplies to the organ. So as you can see here, the post-ganglionic fibers or the post-ganglionic neurons are arising from the ganglia and then they are supplying to the end organ. In case of the post-ganglionic fibers which are arising from the sympathetic trunk, they goes back to the spinal nerves through the gray ramus and then continues in the form of spinal nerve and supplies to the end organ supplied by the spinal nerve. So that is how the peripheral part of the sympathetic autonomic nervous system is. As the autonomic nervous system is mainly based on reflex activity, to complete the circuit, let us see the sympathetic afferent fibers, how these sympathetic afferent fibers are coming from. So these afferent fibers, the sympathetic afferent fibers, or the sensation from the organ is coming through the afferent fibers whose cell body is located in the dorsal root ganglion, and this sensation is then passed on to the preganglionic fibers which are located in the intermediolateral horn of the spinal cord. Through the reflex activity, this preganglionic neuron supplies to the ganglion, and from the ganglion to the postganglionic neurons, and thus this reflex activity elicits the response of the sensation, which appropriate response for the sensation which was carried by the afferent fibers. Let us study in detail the physiological anatomy of parasympathetic nervous system. So the parasympathetic nervous system, as it is called the craniosacral outflow, the preganglionic neurons are arising from the two different parts. These are the cranial part, cranial parasympathetic outflow, and the sacral parasympathetic outflow. That means from the cranial nerves and from the sacral segment of the spinal cord. From the cranial nerves, the parasympathetic outflow, it arises from the third cranial nerve, the 7th, 9th and the 10th cranial nerve. Let us see one by one all of these cranial nerves. So the first is the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, which is the origin for the preganglionic neurons of the third cranial nerve. As you can see here, the Edinger-Westphal nucleus give rise to the preganglionic neurons for the third cranial nerve, and this is carried in the oculomotor nerve or the third cranial nerve, and then it forms the synapse in the ciliary ganglion. From this the postganglionic fibers are arising and supplying to the pupillary muscles, the smooth muscles in the pupils. Now coming to the superior salivary nucleus and the lacrimal nucleus. Why we are considering together? Because they both are carried through the 7th cranial nerve. So the preganglionic neurons which are carried in the 7th cranial nerve are arising from the superior salivary nucleus and lacrimal nucleus. The lacrimal nucleus give rise to the preganglionic fibers which supplies the pterygopalatine ganglion. From this pterygopalatine ganglion, the fiber supplies to the lacrimal gland. So the 7th cranial nerve is supplying the sublingual, submaxillary gland and the lacrimal gland. Now coming to the inferior salivary nucleus. This inferior salivary nucleus is carried, the preganglionic neurons which are arising from the inferior salivary nucleus is carried through the 9th cranial nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve, and then this synapse in the otic ganglion, and then it supplies to the parotid gland. So the inferior salivary nucleus, preganglionic fibers arising and carried in the 9th cranial nerve, synapse in the otic ganglion. From there the postganglionic fiber arises and supplies to the parotid gland. Dorsal vagus nucleus give rise to the preganglionic fibers which are carried in the vagus nerve. These then supplies to the postganglionic fibers then supplies to the lungs, heart, stomach, intestine, and up to the 2/3 of the transverse colon in the large intestine. So as we can see here, these are the cranial origin of the preganglionic fibers of the parasympathetic nervous system. Let us see at the sacral parasympathetic outflow. So the sacral parasympathetic outflow are arising from the S2, S3 and S4 segments. As we can see here in the diagram, the preganglionic fiber arising from these segments are carried through the spinal nerves and then synapse in the ganglion, peripheral ganglion. From these ganglions, the postganglionic fibers are supplying to the urinary bladder and the pelvic visceral organs like intestine, sigmoid colon and rectum. So these are the organs which are supplied by the sacral outflow of the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Now the parasympathetic ganglions, as we can see, there are different ganglions which we have already studied, are lying near to the organs, end organs which are supplied by the parasympathetic system, and these are the peripheral ganglions of the parasympathetic nervous system. Then coming to the parasympathetic afferent fibers. The afferent fibers of the parasympathetic nervous system are similar to the afferent fibers of the sympathetic nervous system. As we can see, the same course is followed, and the afferent fibers are the fibers from the dorsal root ganglion which then synapse with the preganglionic neurons in either the spinal cord or in the nucleus of the cranial nerves. So this is how the peripheral part of the parasympathetic nervous system completes the circuit, and that is how the autonomic nervous system acts in a reflex action method. In the next class, we are going to study the physiological considerations or the physiological aspects of the autonomic nervous system. Thank you.